You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney, with experts and insiders on what you need to know in Northeast Ohio.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm Stephanie Haney. I'm so happy that you're here with me today. Hey, did you know that May is National Egg Month? I'm not really talking about human eggs. I'm talking about the kind of eggs that you eat for breakfast, but we are talking about eggs, so that's a fun fact I wanted to throw out there for you. If you are a breakfast enthusiast, enjoy your eggs for the month of May. But what we are talking about are human eggs, and this is the second episode in a three-part series where we're talking about egg freezing. One of the reasons that we're talking about this right now is because the Today Show recently reported that fertility clinics say that egg freezing is up among women right now. Now, there's a lot of reasons that could be. In the article, they talk about it. It could be possible that this is sort of a side effect because clinics were closed during the pandemic, but it could also be because people are sort of thinking about their futures in a different way now that we have just we're still in it, but we are on the verge of coming out of this pandemic if you pay attention to what's happening around the world. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, last week, we talked about the process of testing beforehand. If you're thinking about freezing your eggs, how you might know if you're a good candidate for it, how successful you might be, and all of that kind of stuff, and the testing. That's something that I did. I did freeze my eggs back in 2019, and I went through that whole process. Now, that testing process, took me about 7 months. I thought it was going to be over so fast. I thought I was going to just walk in there, we were going to do the thing, and be done with it inside of a month. But I was very wrong about that. You can listen all about that in the first episode. If you haven't heard that, I encourage you to go back. My guest for that episode was Cleveland Clinic Director of the IVF program, Dr. Marjan Attaran. She's back with us today, by the way. And what we'll be talking about today is the actual process of freezing your eggs. Because once you pull the trigger, it moves very fast. When I did it, it took me 10 days from my first monitoring appointment in the clinic to the actual egg retrieval process. Now, I ended up with 8 frozen eggs, and they are chilling. They're on ice somewhere in the New England states, just hanging out at a facility that specializes in cryopreservation. During that 10-day time span, there are a lot of steps, okay? It goes fast, but there's a lot to really unpack there. First of all, there's all the medications that you get and the different things that they do. I actually have an unboxing video of the medications that I got on my YouTube page that you can check out. That'll be linked here in the show notes, and I'll link that on wkyc.com. But it was a little bit overwhelming, to say the least. And then there's actually learning how to mix those medications, how to give yourself the injections if you don't have someone to do it for you, where on your body to put those injections, the timing of it, and just a whole lot of information. And by the way, once you actually go in for the egg retrieval process, it takes about 15 minutes. You are under anesthesia for it, and I have a funny video of me under the anesthesia as well. I'll link that too. That's also on my YouTube page. And all of this is on my Instagram account too, by the way, because I documented this entire thing. And we'll talk more about that. I'll talk more about that with Dr. Attaran, who is back with us again today to talk about this process. But the goal here is to just demystify all of it, because if you've never tried to have children before and you are at a point where you're thinking about preserving your fertility, which is kind of what we're talking about here with the whole egg freezing thing, this could be very foreign to you. So it was really helpful for me to learn from other people who had gone through it. And let me just tell you, the messages that I got from people while I was going through it were so incredibly helpful. So I hope that you find this helpful, and along those lines, we're going to bring Dr. Attaran back right now to talk to us about the entire process in the second half of our conversation about egg freezing. Dr. Attaran, thanks for coming back on the Three Things to Know podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've gone through all the considerations. We've done the diagnostic testing. We have an idea of what we might be able to expect. Someone has decided to go through with egg freezing. Can you give us just a ballpark idea? How long does the process start from day one to the point when you're actually extracting eggs to be frozen?
So from the time that you begin your first injection till the time that you have the retrieval is almost 2 weeks.
Okay. See, I initially thought that it would be quite an extensive period of time. So at first I thought, when I realized it would only be 2 weeks, I was shocked that it's so quickly, because I think another thing that we hear about a lot is the IVF process, and that's quite longer, right? That's more than 2 weeks.
So traditional IVF, meaning you're creating an embryo and then implanting the embryo, yes, it will be longer because it, of course, includes the 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then the time frame after that for the actual creation of the embryo and placement back inside, which can be another, based on the program, 3 to 5 days, or based on if genetic testing is done, perhaps another 2 weeks has gone by, and then the whole embryo transfer might potentially be happening at another cycle completely.
Okay, that's the perfect explanation for us to sort of think about how egg freezing fits into the broader spectrum, which is something you might consider down the road if you end up freezing eggs and then using them to create a baby. All right, so let's talk about the very first step. What's the very first step once you come to a doctor and say, okay, let's get this project started? Do you have to start with another ultrasound again, like you did with the diagnostic testing?
So typically the stimulation begins at the beginning of a period. So within the first 3 to 5 days. And so some people have been on a short duration of birth control pills. And the value of the birth control pills in that case is that you can clearly determine the exact date that the person is supposed to start their injections. But perhaps I should step back one bit, and that is, where do you get these medications, right? And so there's a lot of conversation that's happening with our amazing IVF nurses to figure out where your insurance company or what specialty pharmacy it is that you need to use to try to get these drugs sent to them so you can pick them up. You also have to have learned how to take these injections or have a support person that's coming into the encounters and learning it. There's obviously so many things that you can do online to learn again how to take these injections. And then you're also becoming familiar with sort of the setup of this program that you're going to. Where are the ultrasound rooms? Where do I get my blood drawn? What time of the day does it work with my busy schedule? What do we need from you in terms of the timing of these things so we can get results back and make decisions about your blood work and your ultrasound? And I think the steps, again, before could also include infectious disease testing, potentially genetic testing, that would be discussed at the first encounter too.
Okay, I have a million questions for you about the injections. So we'll start with those there, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about the logistics of it, because let me tell you, when I was going through this process, there were some very early mornings getting to Midtown New York so I could get my blood drawn before getting to work at the office at about 8:30 a.m. But we'll get to that in just a moment here. First, I want to talk about the injections, and that's the stimulation that you've talked about. So what are the injections that people are giving themselves or having someone give them when you go through the egg freezing process, and what is the point of them? What do they do?
Yep. That's the $1 million question, right? And so the name of the drug is follicle stimulating hormone. And if you remember, I told you in these follicles, there are granulosa cells. These granulosa cells, which nurture and create the estrogen for that follicle, and they're nurturing, obviously, the oocyte in there, they have receptors for FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. So the more FSH you give to these follicles, the more it's going to make these granulosa cells divide and grow, and so therefore the follicle will grow. And because these FSH levels that you're getting through these injections are so much higher than what your brain normally makes, this is why you grow multiple follicles, not just the one follicle.
Okay. Now, here's a question that I see asked a lot. We are born with all of the eggs that we're ever going to have. So when we go through this process and we're stimulating more of them to grow to a point where they could be frozen, what are we doing? Are we reaching into our ovarian reserves and pulling out more than otherwise would be at a given time? Is this impacting our future fertility in any way?
No, there's no information or no data to say that you're compromising your fertility. But I think the more important question that patients have asked me is, does this mean I'm going to go through menopause earlier? Because you grew, 20 eggs and normally I just grow one egg. And the answer is no, you are not going through menopause earlier. Remember what we talked about, the waves of follicles that are growing, right? There's a wave of 20 to 100 follicles that start to grow. And naturally, only one makes it. Everybody else dies off. When you're doing IVF or this process of egg growth and freezing, well, again, maybe 20 of the batch grow, and it's the batch that would have died off, right? So they're growing, and that's why you do not end up compromising your future number of eggs that you have.
Okay. And these injections, that we give ourselves, the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is that something that our body creates naturally?
Yes, the pituitary gland creates FSH.
Okay. And when you're doing these injections, where do we do this injection? Is it in the arm? Where do we do it?
Typically, thank God nowadays, you can give it subcutaneously, which is awesome compared to intramuscular. And so typically where women inject it is actually into the abdominal wall and the fatty tissue there, because most women probably have the most amount of fat there. But you could do it in the upper thighs, anywhere that there is, you can pick up your skin and feel that there's some tissue underneath there to inject.
Okay, that's what I did. The thigh. I tried the belly area, kind of like right around the belly button, like a little lower to the right of the belly button, and that was much more painful for me for some reason than the thigh. I'm not sure why that might have been.
Just remember, back in the 90s, I think it was, there were women that were just turning around and giving themselves intramuscular injections into the butt.
Oh my gosh.
So it hurt you, but it wouldn't have hurt that bad compared to that.
Yeah. And you'd have to have a nice mirror, I imagine, so that you could see what you were doing to get that in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about side effects of these shots? Is there anything that people should be on the lookout for while they're doing these injections?
Yeah. So honestly, the side effects of the shots go along with what you're really expecting to happen, right? So normally maybe your ovary is about this big, right? And now you have, let's say, 10 follicles growing on each ovary. So now your ovary is going to be this big. Of course you're going to feel that, right? You're
so
going
like golf ball, for the people listening, not watching on YouTube, from the size of a golf ball to maybe like a softball, would you say?
Yeah, very cool. Yep, that's right. So you will feel physically different. You're uncomfortable. You're wearing your clothes that might be a little bit less fitting than usual. But in regards to the hormones, like doing anything to you otherwise, no. Some people can have local reactions, but that's very, very rare. These needles are incredibly small.
Okay. And what about lifestyle changes? Can you have a glass of wine while you're undergoing these shots? Or, maybe to the more extreme, have a wild Saturday night out? What do you recommend there?
So probably the wild Saturday night out is not a good idea.
All right.
But the random glass of wine would be fine. I would say more so the concern is in regards to athletics, okay? So if you've got this larger ovary, you're uncomfortable. Remember, the ovary's got a blood supply to it that kind of hangs on if this is the blood supply, this is the ovary sitting over here. And so as you're jogging along, this big ovary is yanking at its stalk, and that can hurt for the individual. And rarely, thank God, somebody can twist an ovary. So it is not a physiologic process, right? We are in a supraphysiologic mode. And so your physical activities have to kind of you have to really be conscious of what it is that you're doing before you just kind of do it.
Okay. Well, you see where my head's at. I'm worried about the glasses of wine, not so much the jogging. To each their own.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the logistics of this. There's blood testing and there's ultrasounds throughout this process, which is a scheduling concern. You need to be able to figure out how often are those happening and what's the point of these along the way.
Yep. So people are coming in probably every 2 to 4 days. Okay. So in the beginning, you come in for a baseline, we say. So that could be like, let's say on cycle day 3. And at that time, you get your ultrasound, which looks at the follicles, and you're getting blood work, which is typically an estradiol level. You expect the estrogen level to be low at the beginning of the cycle because you're just beginning the recruitment process, right? And so then, let's say 3 or 4 days later, you come back in again, another ultrasound, another blood work. In the meantime, you've taken 4 days worth of drugs. And so the assumption is that there's a batch of follicles that now have grown. And of course, you're going to have a higher estrogen level, right? And your follicles, which maybe were less than 5 millimeters at the first scan, might now be sitting at 10 millimeters, right? And so this regimen continues over the next 8 to 10 days, 8 to 12 days. We typically expect the follicles to become totally mature within 8 to 14 days of when you begin the drugs. And at some point along the way, you're using the estrogen and the follicle size to make a decision about, should we increase the dosage of your medication? Should we decrease the dosage of your medication? At what point should we be adding what's called an antagonist to the regimen? If you may remember, it's the medicine to stop you from ovulating on your own, because we don't want you to lose the whole cycle at 3 a.m. if you had a spontaneous ovulation on your own. So most young women going through the egg freeze process will be taking 2 injections a day prior to getting to the point where the follicles are now mature.
Okay, and then once you get to the point where the follicles are mature, there's one final injection that you have to take, right? And that's a certain amount of time before your procedure to retrieve these eggs. What is that injection and what does that do?
Yep. So that's called the trigger shot. And for, again, most people that are what's called, they're on the antagonist protocol, which is what we typically do for younger women that are preserving eggs, okay, compared to the woman coming in purely for infertility reasons. So they end up getting a shot of Lupron. And so this is a drug that makes your brain, that pituitary gland that we talked about, secrete high doses of LH and FSH. And so that LH, of course, is what ovulation is about, right? But now we're timing it. So we might say to you, take it at 10 o'clock at night, and now at 10 a.m., 36 hours later, you're coming in for your retrieval. The egg must see that LH. If it doesn't see the LH, number one, we may not even be able to remove the egg, okay, because it may just be adhered to the side wall. Number two, the egg will not have matured completely. So it won't be a metaphase 2 egg, which is what we really need for somebody that's trying to freeze their eggs. And we need to obviously freeze mature eggs.
Okay, so assuming everything has gone as planned, you've gone through your protocol, you've taken that trigger shot, we're 36 hours later, we go in for the procedure. What is the procedure like when someone is extracting these eggs? Is where are you going in at to get these things?
Yep. So in America, of course, I would say that the majority of programs, the patient is under some form of general anesthesia. Okay, they're not intubated, but they're certainly getting enough medications to be asleep for the process, which is great, because the transvaginal ultrasound probe, of course, is in the vagina, and you're looking at the same image that you would have been looking every time you come in every morning, right, to look at your ovaries. But now there's a needle adjacent to the probe, and we're aiming it for each one of those follicles / black holes that you may remember seeing on the scans, and then decompressing each one of these fluid-filled spaces. And then the fluid and hopefully the egg that's in there is trapped in a test tube, which is probably where the old name of test tube babies came from. And then the tube is given to the embryologist, who looks at it underneath the microscope to say, is there an egg there or isn't there an egg there?
And that whole process to get all of those eggs out, how long does that take?
Not very long, 15, 20 minutes max.
It is surprisingly quick.
Yes.
It really is. And also, by the way, I should let people know I've got photos of my scans and things, so you'll see exactly what Dr. Attaran was talking about there with the black holes. Those will be linked on WKYC.com, so you'll be able to take a look at that. It's kind of interesting. I've had it described as something that looks like a chocolate chip cookie.
Chocolate chip cookie? That's the first time that I've heard that.
Yeah, those little black holes. Yep. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about something that I have heard lovingly referred to as egg math. So thinking back now to when we were talking about the testing, when you have those initial ultrasounds to take a look at how many antral follicles you might have at a certain point, you've got a number that starts there. When you do your baseline testing, when you start the egg freezing, you do the ultrasound, you get a baseline number of how many antral follicles it looks like your body has at that particular moment. I started with 16 when I did mine in July of 2019. Now, throughout the process of the injections, only 8 grew to a size that they thought might be mature enough to freeze. Now, in a lot of cases, even all 8 of those might not have actually been freezable. They might not have been mature enough to freeze. Luckily for me, all 8 of them were freezable. So best case scenario based on the 8 that grew for me. But that's not always the case, is it?
Yeah, I think it's very misleading to patients when at the first scan, they're told your antral follicle count today was 16, okay? Because it does not mean that they're actually going to respond to the drugs that you're taking. So this is an everyday conversation, honestly, with patients. So after, let's say, 10, 12 days of stimulation, and you have grown your batch of follicles and you're about to get your trigger shot, okay? At that time, you're looking at most likely the number of follicles that are greater than 12 or 13 millimeters in size to say, these guys, if you've got 6 of them that are greater than that number, they're likely to be mature, okay? Now, of course, at the time of the retrieval, the needle is going into every follicle that we see, and we're not measuring that this one is 10 and this one is 12. And of course, there will have been growth from the time of the trigger shot till the time that we're actually doing the retrieval, right? So what happens then is you might get 15 eggs. You don't know which one came from which because you're just kind of busy, sucking everything out that you see. And then you might be surprised that out of the 15, only 8 of them were mature. And I think that's what can be discouraging to the patient. In terms of the mismatch of expectations.
Mm-hmm. I was definitely, it was a bummer for me when I had my procedure to only have 8. And I say only, 8 is a, it's not a bad number for my age in my mid 30s. But then when all 8 were mature enough to freeze, that was a happy result for me there. Let's talk about that freezing though. What happens to the eggs once they're outside of the body?
So typically they're sitting in a culture for a couple of hours because the granulosa cells that are around them start dispersing naturally. And then what they do is they sort of remove the granulosa cells ultimately, and they get to have a really good look at the egg to actually see, does it meet the certain criteria for it to be able to be frozen or not. And typically you want that egg to be what we call a metaphase 2 egg. If you try to freeze other eggs, they just won't survive the thaw process. So there's no pregnancies that are associated with them. And then sort of the big deal breaker, which is probably a bit beyond me, but is sort of the technology that's being used in the laboratory, is this process of vitrification that the embryologists have become amazing at, and really has been the reason why there's been such good success with use of frozen eggs for establishing pregnancies. That's the technology that's really been on the upswing, I would say, for the past 10 years.
Okay. Now, we mentioned before, it only takes one to get pregnant, right? But when you do go into this, you do hope to have a good number, because the more you have, the more likely you've got one in there that might work. I've got 8, that's an okay number. I'd like to have more, but some people do multiple rounds of egg freezing in hopes of getting that number higher and higher, just to have, for use, whether you're using that, whether you have a plan to ultimately use them or you're using them as an insurance policy, which is kind of how I look at it. I just kind of like having them there in case it doesn't work out for me naturally. What is there a certain number that people should be looking at that you'd like to have frozen if you're using this in that way?
Yeah, so this is kind of like a slippery slope, this concept of having a certain number, because it implies that there's some kind of a guarantee for having a baby using these eggs. And I think that's where so many people that are writing the guidelines and sort of in the administrative world of, whether it's the European or the American Society of Reproduction, they're worried that when we, as the doc sitting in front of the patient, are talking to them about egg freezing, that we might not be clear enough that there is no certain number of eggs that you're going to have that's going to guarantee you a baby. Having said that, there are studies which state that the older you are, the more number of eggs it is that you should freeze, right? Mm-hmm. So for the average 37-year-old, the number will be, okay, have 20 eggs so that you have about a 75% chance of having a live born baby. But you hear it's 75%. It's not 100% by any means.
Right. Okay. So that's going to obviously vary depending on the age of your body at the time you froze your eggs and the number that would be associated with that kind of a percentage, right?
Yes, it depends on your age. It probably even depends, honestly, on your own biology, right? Most of us feel like, wow, if you actually did produce a lot of eggs that first time around, does that say something about the quality of the eggs too? So, but it's not a clear relationship.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That does. I want to go back before I let you go here to a question that we asked at the very beginning of our first conversation. We were talking about the difference between eggs and embryos. From a medical perspective only, is there any medical benefit between freezing eggs and taking that other step and fertilizing those eggs and having them develop into an embryo before they're frozen?
So I think the only benefit for having a frozen embryo is that you actually know the outcome in regards to the number of embryos you're going to end up with. Okay? When you have frozen eggs, even though the survival rate when you thaw the eggs has improved astronomically, and depending on the individual lab that you went to, let's say in that New York program, they might say we've got a 90% survival rate, 95% survival rate for these eggs. You actually still don't know what percentage of them are going to fertilize, right? And so because it's an unknown, when you've got frozen embryos, well, there's a certain level of comfort to say I've got 6 embryos frozen, You can't say, even if you have 12 eggs that are frozen, right?
Right. So it goes back to that egg math situation. You start with a certain number of follicles, only so many might mature, only so many might be good enough to freeze, only so many might be good enough to fertilize, and only so many of them might actually result in a fertilized embryo.
That is right. And take it further. And so many of them make it to a blastocyst stage, like every step of the way, there is going to be attrition.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Attaran, for everything you've done with us over these past 2 conversations to really demystify the egg freezing process. I think this would be a great resource for women who are considering doing this, for whatever their reasons might be. So I really appreciate your time here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me such great questions.
So much good information from Dr. Attaran. It is a complex process. It goes fast, but it's a complex process. Like I said, for me, it was 10 days. As the doctor said, that can range in time, so just keep that in mind if it's something that you're thinking about for your planning, that you don't really know actually how long your cycle is going to be if you do decide to move forward with the egg freezing process. Now, it can be stressful, obviously, for sure. You're trying to fit in those appointments. You're not sure how many eggs you're going to be able to retrieve. That was very stressful for me. For sure. So Our need to know in NEO this week is something that will help you hopefully relieve a little bit of stress. Did you know that we have an alpaca farm here in Northeast Ohio? We do, and it's in Medina, and it's called the Majestic Meadows Alpaca Farm. And this is perfect timing to be talking about this when we're talking about the whole egg freezing and family planning thing, because they just had 2 new baby alpacas born there, a little boy and a little girl. They posted it on their Instagram page. Their Instagram page is _alpaca_boutique. Again, _alpaca_boutique. And you can hand feed these little babies and really get up close and personal with them. Talk about a good stress reliever. And they don't just have alpacas, they have all kinds of little animals. They have llamas, they have miniature baby doll sheep, they have miniature horses, miniature donkeys, and one of my favorites, miniature pot-bellied pigs. And they are so sweet. You can see all of them on that Instagram page that I just told you about. They're open from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you can make reservations so you can have your own personal experience with all of their sweet little babies. And you can make that reservation on their website. The website is majesticmeadowsalpacas.com. And that brings me to a good follow for this week. And this is a woman who is all up in the egg freezing space. Her name is Valerie Landis. She's based in Kent right now. We actually snagged her from the city of Chicago. She's been a friend of mine for a while now. We brought her in, love bringing in these Ohio transplants over the past couple years. She has done 3 cycles herself of egg freezing. Her eggs are currently in long-term storage, and she has collected a bunch of stories from women who have gone through egg freezing cycles. So, I'm sharing my experience with you here. She shares her experience. If you really want to see a ton of different experiences from people all around the world. I think the most recent person that she talked to was from South Africa. I've talked to her about my experience. You're going to want to follow her and check that out. Her Instagram page for the website is eggsperience_. So obviously that's a play on the word experience, and you know how much I love a good pun. So it's EGGSPERIENCE_. I'll have that linked, of course, in the show notes and on WKYC.com. She's got the website with all of those profiles from people sharing their experiences. She's got a podcast that goes along with it called Eggology Club. And she has a forthcoming documentary about egg freezing that she's been working on, which will be very exciting when that becomes available. You can find all of this at her sort of landing page, which is shore.by/Valerie D. Landis. And I will also obviously have that linked in the show notes and on WKYC.com. She's a great follow if you're considering egg freezing, just if you want to see some personal testimonies from people who have been through it, and a total wealth of people that you can check out sharing that experience. All right, that's it for this week's 3 Things to Know. Next week, we are talking all about the considerations at play that are aside from the testing, aside from the actual process. We're talking about the money and the law. There's a trend right now that it's being offered as a benefit, egg freezing, some places when you get a new job or maybe at an established job. We're also going to talk about the insurance aspect, what changes are happening there in the industry, and how this is being treated from a medical perspective in that space. And then we'll talk about something that I'm very passionate about, which is the property rights issue of this whole thing and sort of the differences between freezing your eggs and freezing embryos. And that's all coming next week in our 3rd and final installment on this little mini egg freezing series. So I hope you'll join me back for that. And if you've been enjoying the show, please let me know. Leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with a friend so that we can connect with more people here in Northeast Ohio. All right, everybody, I'll see you back next week. Between now and then, stay safe and be well. I'm Stephanie Haney.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.